Thought we'd do something new, or try something a bit different. So let's start with this. Try some old-fashioned technology here.
Mind the gap. Mind the gap. Mind the gap.
How many of you know where that's from? Where's it from? The London Underground. Yes, any of you who've travelled, I don't know if they say it anymore, but that's all I used to remember about the London Underground. Mind the gap. And why do they say that? Well, because the danger's not that obvious. When the train comes along, it looks like it's aligned to the platform, but lo and behold, the gap is usually a bit more than you think, so you have to be careful. The gap is bigger than you think. And that's really what I want to talk about, that gap that is often bigger than we think. And that's really our human experience. And it was something that really struck me in the last week that made me decide that's what I'd like to look at more deeply this morning. So often, the distance between us and someone else is more than we ever imagined, even if we try to imagine it. So I had an example in business. Some of you will know that I'm often involved in business negotiations, trying to buy or sell a business, and we were representing a seller, and I had sent some information, and I was waiting for a counter offer, and I was trying to imagine what they would come back with, what price they would come back with, and understand the buyer quite well, and getting myself ready for the response, and what would be reasonable from their side. And then the offer came in, and it was completely worse than I expected. How many times have we experienced that? Even when I try to understand the other side, the gap is even further. It's even bigger than I imagined. And in the same week, we were dealing with, some family, and there were some personal relationships, and there was some misunderstanding and tension, all about this. And again, I was doing my best to try to imagine it from the other person's perspective, to get into their moccasins, to see how they might feel and how they might respond, and what might be going on inside them, and waiting for their response and imagining what it might be. And when it came, it was so much further away from me than I ever expected, even though I tried to bridge the gap. And so again, I remembered that the gap is bigger than we think. So what's going on here? What's happening in our lives if you've had similar experiences to me? Why is the distance between people always bigger than we might imagine? And I guess you probably know it's because we are biased towards our own point of view. We find it very difficult to see things through the eyes of someone else. We can't truly enter into their experience and into their story and everything that's going on in their mind. And even our best empathy to do that has very clear limits. And so what I wanted to do this morning is to look at Scripture and say, well, can we get some help? Because I sure need help, and I hope maybe you might need some help on this topic. How can we maybe improve minding the gap in our own everyday living? And the interesting thing is that actually it all starts with the biggest gap of them all. And the biggest gap of them all is really the gap between us and God. The divine distance, the distance between you and I and the God that we worship. And it's interesting because after the fall, we find out that gap is actually infinite. It can't be measured in meters or feet or even kilometers. And we know this because God says when he describes him and us, he says in Isaiah chapter 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heaven is higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So God is saying that you might try to think like me. You might try to understand my ways, but there's an infinite gap between where I am and where you are. So that's actually quite amazing to think that gap is so huge. Well, we know that infinite gap is what actually becomes then the horizontal gap. It's what causes the gap between you and I. It's related to the fact that there's a gap between us and our designer and our creator. And so we have the first story, well, maybe the second story in Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. And it's interesting, it's like we know the story so well. So, like with all stories we know so well, we don't often deconstruct them. But have you ever thought about this? That here is Cain and Abel, and they're trying to deal with the gap between themselves and the divine, and they come and they bring their offerings. And the purpose of the offering is to mind the gap between them and God. And we read that God had not respect for Cain's offering or for Cain. And then Cain is angry. It said Cain was very wroth and his countenance fell. Who was he angry with? Well, with God. It was God who had not allowed Cain to bridge the gap. But then he kills his brother. He's shaking his fist at God and kills his brother. And that's a very, very interesting principle. It teaches us that the gap that we have between each other originates because of the gap that we have between us and God. And that's the first principle I learned when looking at this study. If you find in your life right now that a lot of your relationships are in an awkward space, that you find that you're in a particular place where you're battling to mend gaps, well, the first principle is, how's the relationship that you have with God? Because if that is broken, if you haven't been able to repair that gap, then you will find it very difficult to repair this gap between you and your brother or your sister. And so we know Cain kills his brother Abel. But the beautiful thing in the story, in the gospel story, is that God says, I will bridge the infinite gap. And that's the turning point, isn't it? That he sends his son, the Lord Jesus Christ, as the way to bridge the gap. But we coming this morning and we're trying to learn more about how we can deal with our gaps. So let's enter into how he does it. Because there's something going on here that will open up wisdom for you and I. We read this in Philippians 2. Who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, speaking of Jesus, he made himself nothing. Taking the very nature of a servant, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even the death of the cross. And this is the great surprise of the gospel. God doesn't try and deal with the gap from a distance. He doesn't shout over this great gap and say, here I am, make your way back to me. Through his son, the Lord Jesus Christ, he comes down. He comes down to us. He experiences flesh and blood. Jesus, who was made like us in every way, a high priest that comes into our world to experience us and to reconcile us through that process. And what is the process? It's one of humility. It says he humbled himself and became as a servant. So immediately we're seeing some patterns. If you're going to close a gap, you need to enter into the world of the other. And that has to be done through humility. And so we have God's solution to the infinite gap in the person of Jesus Christ. And that would be the answer. I could sit down right now and say, you have a problem in your life with a relationship. You're battling to mind the gap. The distance always seems further. Then Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the great gap filler. Jesus is the one who bridges the gap. But you see, I guess if I said that, you would say, well, we knew that before, Matt. Thanks for coming. So I want us just to stop for a moment and think, what does that actually mean? How can that truth, which is no doubt a truth, be something that I can take with me in the week to come with those relationships that I'm battling with? Gaps, we see, are not closed by effort from below, but by humility and initiative from above. So that's the first principle we're going to learn about. Now, here's an interesting thing. Jesus, as I've said, is the gap in between people. You know this passage very well, often quoted when we get together here in a church service, For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, them am I with them. Then am I in the midst of them. You know that passage well. And we often quote that. It's often applied in the circumstance of saying, we've gathered together here in church, and thank goodness there's more than one of us. Because there's 2 and 3, Jesus is here as well. Now, I want to tell you, that is probably the biggest misapplication of that passage ever. That's not what Jesus is saying there. Because if that were, it would mean that Jesus can't be with you when you're on your own. And do you think Jesus can be with you when you're on your own? Or does he need 2 people to be with us? So it can't be that he was saying that. So let's think about that verse for a moment. Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered, and here's the key word, there am I in the midst of them. In other words, when you gather together in my name, I am the one in between you. I am the one who fills the gap between brother and sister, between old and young, between married and single, between black and white, between Jew and Gentile. I am the one in the middle. And if you think that's not the application, well, you just have to ask yourself, where does this passage appear? Matthew chapter 18. And the whole of Matthew chapter 18, by the way, which I won't take you through verse by verse, is the chapter on bridging the gap. Remember, that's the passage. If your brother sins against you, how are you going to deal with it? You're going to ignore the gap between you and your brother or your sister, or are you going to begin a process of reconciliation? It's the same chapter. When a sheep goes missing, are you going to leave it, or are you going to try and reconcile? It is the chapter of reconciliation. And right in the middle, Jesus says, I am the glue. I am the one in the midst. So, what does that mean? How can we take this wisdom into our own lives now that we understand that Jesus is the one who fills the gap? Well, the first is, I guess, very simple. We need to acknowledge it's his work from above that can heal our broken relationships. So whatever it is you're dealing with, maybe it's a relationship in work. Maybe it's some tension that you just can't overcome. Maybe it's a relationship with a family member. Maybe it's with a friend that you're just not getting on with again. Maybe it's closer to home. It's with a spouse, a husband, or a wife. Have you truly asked Jesus to be active? Not in him, because he needs to be more godlike, or in you, because you need to be more godlike, but in the gap in between. Have you called him to help to heal the space between you and the other? So that's the first way that Jesus is the one who helps us to mind the gap. But there's more than that. Because when Jesus is the solution, when he is the answer, then not only do we call upon him to be active like he said we could through his Spirit, we also listen to him. And we get the opportunity to listen to Jesus not just by, well, I guess, hearing things through the things that are spoken by others, the nudges that God gives us in our life when we open ourselves to his messages, but we get to see what he did, to see the patterns by which he lived in the 4 Gospels. And so how did Jesus go about minding the gap in his life upon earth in the 4 Gospels? And just to bring this little consideration to a practical conclusion, I want to just look at 4 or 5 techniques that Jesus used to bridge the gap that maybe we can apply in our own relationships today. And to make it easy to remember, as my brother-in-law Lucas always does, I have a little acronym. And the acronym is REACH. When we have a gap between us and a friend or a brother or a sister or a husband and wife, well, the first thing we need to do is to learn to reach. So we're going to go through the letters of reach and look at how Jesus minded the gap. And the first principle is for the letter R in reach, which stands in this case for relate. Jesus, in his encounters with people, always started by seeing them and trying to relate to them, trying to understand them. Think of the story of the woman at the well in Samaria. Think of the gap between Jesus and her. There was a religious gap, Jew and Samaritan. There was a gender gap. There was a social gap. The distance between Jesus and the woman of Samaria couldn't have been further. But immediately, he sees her. She's not just nobody at the well. And he communicates with her. And he seeks to understand her. And we know this is pivotal. You know, she isn't transformed. She isn't reconciled necessarily because of his theology. And he actually does give her a bit of theology. What does she say at the end of it all? What is her testimony? Come see a man who told me all things ever I did. Well, what does that mean? It's a lovely phrase, but what does it mean in common vernacular? Come and see a person who knows everything about me, who took the time to see me and to understand me and to relate to me, and this is the man to whom I am reconciled. R means relate. People open up, not when they are merely corrected, but they open up when they feel seen. And too often we want to go around correcting people before we see them. And no doubt Jesus was doing just that. And that's why many human attempts to close gaps fail. I think I understand the buyer. I think I understand the other person. But often I understand a simplified version of them because I haven't truly taken the time to relate. And Jesus shows us that the first movement has to be deeper. It has to be more personal. We have to see the person and not the label, to see the story and not just the position. So think about it. Where might you be assuming that you understand the other person when you have not really seen them or understood them? E in reach, stands for entering into their world. It's one thing to see and to understand, but the way that you truly understand somebody is to try as best you can, as the native Indian little phrase was, to walk in their moccasins for a mile. To enter into the world. So often we want people to be reconciled with us and they must come to our world and our way of thinking in order to close the gap. Remember when Jesus saw Zacchaeus, that corrupt tax collector that everybody hated, that ate with publicans and sinners? And isn't it just amazing that we've got this picture created of Zacchaeus up in the sycamore tree, and we know he's there because he's a very short little guy, but there's distance. That's what the text is showing us. There's a gap between Zacchaeus and Jesus and all of the Jewish community. And here comes the gap filler. And what is the first thing he says to Zacchaeus? Well, first of all, come a bit closer, my friend. Come down from the tree, for I must stay at your house tonight. He wasn't even invited. I'm coming to stay at your house. I'm going to enter into your world. Now, we read those words again. We've heard them many times, but they're shocking. They were shocking for the community. This rabbi is not just speaking to Zacchaeus, this corrupt, evil, corrupt, taking money from everybody person. This is who we're talking about. This is Paul Moshateli. He's going to go and live at his house. He's going to enter his world so that he can, I should have said Zuma, so that he can close the gap. And he's going to stay at Nkandla. I hope this isn't being recorded. He's going to go and stay at Nkandla. That's a completely different way of reaching into somebody's space. And so in conflict, entering into someone else's world is a way that we can see how they frame things, how they think about the world. And it is the way that we can understand their side. And so, like, for example, in the business example that I gave you, to enter into the world of the buyer is for me to truly understand the risks that they are processing when they think about buying this business and what it might do to them, rather than trying to justify the seller's position of what the value of the business should be. Again, it's a very difficult thing to do, but we can only try to do it and to enter into the world of somebody else. So whose world do you need to enter, rather than them waiting for them to enter your world? So now we come to A, the next one, if I can get there. Good. And A stands, No, keep your spelling right. R-E and A. A stands for ask. Ask and listen. And of course, Jesus was always the great questioner. He wanted to draw out of people what was going on in their minds. Think of the story of the blind man Bartimaeus in Matthew 12. Remember, they're walking down the road and he's crying out, and the disciples say, you know what, please, you're making a scene here. We've got our master, he's very busy, he's trying to make his way, and they try and shoo Bartimaeus. And Jesus stops and he looks at Bartimaeus and says, what can I do for you? I mean, for everybody in the audience, it's pretty obvious. The guy had been falling over blind trying to get to Jesus. Why does Jesus ask him that question? Well, of course, it starts that many questions need to be asked, not just to gain information, but to give someone dignity to express their own needs. Too often, we see people as problems that need to be solved. We're coming with the solution for the clear problem that they have, rather than people who have needs to express. And Jesus listened first. He asked questions to allow people to reveal themselves to him. And once again, for me personally, that's something that I'm not good at all. I already have the solution. In fact, I already know how you're thinking and what you're going to say. And while you are speaking, I'm already designing my answer instead of listening to you. So this is the way Jesus practiced asking and listening. Listening is not only gathering information, it is about giving dignity. And that is crucial for closing gaps. Help me understand how you feel. What do you need me to hear that I am missing? And so we might ask ourselves, in any relationships we're working on, where have you predicted instead of listened? Right now, where are you already predicting what the other person is thinking or saying instead of truly listening to them? Just two to go. C, in reach, stands for communicate truth with compassion. And this has to be the toughest one, by far. Because mostly when a relationship is broken, it's because there are two different versions of the truth. There's your version, and there's their version. And of course, we all know whose version is correct. Our version. And you see, to bridge that gap is to communicate compassionately without letting truth get lost. So we might come to the conclusion, well, the best way, Matthew, to deal with any broken relationship, as you said from the beginning, is humility. Just go to the other person and say, I forgive you, I am humble, all is good. But you and I know that that won't work, that won't last, because it's not built on authenticity and truth. But of course, the other extreme, well, let me tell you where you're going wrong. And let me tell you where the truth is. Well, that won't work, because there's no compassion. Remember when they brought that woman caught in adultery to Jesus? And he says, where now have your accusers gone? Neither do I condemn you. Compassion and forgiveness. Go and sin no more. Truth. There has to be transformation, the opportunity for transformation. And somehow Jesus was able to bring grace and truth together, to bring compassion and authenticity together in a way that we can just marvel at, but at least look at and try to pattern in our own lives. And so it is in our relationships that we must speak with compassion. We must speak with true grace to one another. But we have to share our own authenticity and our own truth. And that's, I guess, the great battle of life. It's the great dance. And we can only get that balance, I believe, through praying and asking for God's guidance in whatever situation we are working with. Truth without compassion creates distance. Compassion without truth avoids transformation. Truth without compassion creates distance. Compassion without truth avoids transformation. So the question becomes, is the truth I'm about to speak designed to win the other person? Or is it designed to hear? Or am I just speaking out of irritation? And because I want to be seen to be right. So think about those relationships you might be thinking of right now. Do I tend to lose compassion in the gap between me and the other? Or do I avoid truth? And either way, in the extreme, will just make the distance get further. And the last in our little word reach is the letter H. And I think this is one of the most profound parts of the way in which God has reached over to reconcile with you and I, and how we should do it with one another. And it's something that I possibly had not really understood before doing this little meditation. H stands for heal and restore and make sure there's a future together. You see, I don't know about you, there are some people that I think I've done a reasonable job. I would have maybe given myself a C or a B plus for reconciliation. But my idea of reconciliation is for me to just get over whatever the issue is with them. And so we had a sit-down conversation, and it was honest, and it was true, and it was compassionate. And I got to the stage where, well, actually, I truly have forgiven them, and they truly have forgiven me. But I'd rather not do much more with them. I'd rather that be the end of the thing. We don't have an issue together, but we haven't got a path to walk together. That's not the way God reconciles with us. Having covered the gap, he says, now I want to hold your hand. I want to walk together arm in arm. That's true reconciliation. Healing and restoring and having a future together. You imagine somebody's betrayed you. Somebody's let you down completely at the most critical time of your life. And you meet with them and you forgive them. But not only that, you say, now that we've dealt with this, I want us to walk together in a new hope together, restored. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Peter, at the most climatic stage of Jesus' life in the Garden of Gethsemane, and what followed as he went to the court of Pontius Pilate, denies Jesus 3 times. The distance between Peter and Jesus could not have been bigger. In fact, that's how it's described. Peter followed Jesus afar off. What does Jesus do once he's raised? Well, he doesn't ignore it. It has to be dealt with. And he calls Peter aside. And he asks him 3 times, do you love me? Forgiveness. Forgiveness for the 3 times that you betrayed me. You can make it good because I know that you love me. But he didn't end there. He didn't say, well, Peter, we are now reconciled and I have forgiven you. What does he say? And now, Peter, I want to give you new hope. Feed my sheep. From this point of being separated, not only are you joined with me now, Peter, I have restored you to be a leader with me going into the future, to build the very church that we are all part of 2,000 years later. He gives him a commission. He truly restores Peter's position as the leader of the church that was to be created once Jesus went into heaven. Jesus does not just fix the past, he restores the future. Imagine if we could think about the broken relationships around us and not only think about just reconciling the hurt of the past, but truly find a way to restore our future with those people. I know it can be overwhelming, but this is the pattern. This is the rhythm of the man we have come to worship and remember this morning. He who fills the gap, Jesus, our Savior. The gap is not just narrowed in Jesus, it is healed. And so when we think of our broken relationships, you might ask yourself, am I trying to win the argument or am I trying to restore the person and our relationship to walk together? So there it is. Reach stands for that we might relate to people, to see and understand them. E, that we might enter into their world, to walk in their moccasins for a mile, to understand the way they think and their culture. A stands to ask and to listen and to truly give them dignity to express their needs rather than just to try and solve the problem. C stands to communicate with compassion and truth and to find the way of getting that balance. And H stands for heal and restore and to give a future together. And all of this is exactly what is expressed in the verse we started with in Philippians 2, where Jesus came down and humbled himself as a servant, entered our world, walked amongst our world, listened to our concerns, and then he healed and he restored and he gave us a future. And as we come to this meal now this morning, it's a meal, yes, about forgiveness, about closing the gap, not just between us and God, but the gap that is between all of us in this room, because he binds us all together. This is the meal of minding the gap, but it's also the meal that restores us to the future, that pulls us to say, we are going somewhere together. Because Jesus said, I will not drink of the cup of wine until we do it together in my Father's kingdom. So, we return to that phrase, mind the gap. On the underground, the warning is because the gap is a lot bigger than it may appear. And the gap between us and other people is bigger than we think. The gap between us and God is infinite. But Jesus steps into that gap and stands in the midst. So where is that gap in your life right now? A relationship, a tension, a misunderstanding, a business negotiation, a family wound? Have you invited Jesus into the middle of that gap? Not just into them or you, but into the middle of the gap. And what would it look like in the week to come if you practice the principles of reach?